So we emerge from the tunnels and run straight into a confrontation between two of the most important groups in the game, the Super Mutants and the Brotherhood of Steel, and that means now is an excellent time to discuss some of the big players in the story. Let's start off with the mutants, and I want to start by pointing out that Fallout 3 does a phenomenal job introducing the mutants. You see, down in the metro tunnels, there's a good chance you'll run into your first one. So far you've just been fighting ghouls and raiders, basically humanoid creatures of a normal size. And then you come around the corner in a smoky tunnel and there's a silhouette in the distance blocking your path at the end of the tunnel of a huge figure. It's a hell of an entrance.
Well, actually, there's a good chance most players' first encounters with the super mutants will be across from the river from the metro entrance they're directed to from Megaton. They're not there initially, but they seem to spawn in once you're across from them. If it weren't for that, however, I would initially agree. Seeing a hulking shadow at the end of the tunnel is a cool fucking entrance. Except that it's ruined by the way this game handles the super mutants, which we'll get to shortly.
Creetosis just can't let John have this point. Even Mr. Caption praised this element of Fallout 3. I guess even Creed can't deny this commonly agreed praise for Fallout 3 in this regards, without sandwiching between two insults and saving the qualifier for that evaluation later in the video.
It's lovely. And it's followed up by letting you fight them in big numbers around GNR with some assistance from the Brotherhood. And after that, you're on your own. The next time you run into the Super Mutants will be when you emerge from the museum station and you see the mall for the first time, converted into a battlefield with Super Mutants patrolling the trenches and fortified positions. It's just a great escalation of threats.
Fighting them. Just fighting them. I'm really glad Bethesda brought in this unique group for them to function as nothing more than generic enemies. Real creative fucking move there, Bethesda.
I don't see how this relates to what John is talking about. Saying something in a sarcastic tone of voice does not help your argument. It seems more like a virtue signaling to anti-Bethesda crowd and simply shows Cree's bias. That might be fine if you're just claiming this is your subjective opinion, and maybe he is. But it damages your case if you want the audience to actually believe that this is anywhere close to being an objective critique of many a true nerd's video. I'm sure many people, including myself, will get that impression that that's what this video of Cree's is trying to say, which leads me to believe that this video is being made in bad faith, pretending he has ulterior motives for this when he has another. The fact that Cree is constantly on the attack and rarely entertains any of John's points or theories is a hint of this.
Anyway, let's talk about the mutants overall, because I have seen them mentioned as a disappointment, and this seems to be because people don't see the mutants as interesting and complicated, next to how they were in Fallout 1.
And Fallout 2. In fact, they are probably far deeper in Fallout 2, which makes their fall here that much more frustrating.
This is clearly appeal to emotion by Creed, while at the same time implying that John is leaving out the context to his history lesson.
Just because you've never played it, the original mutants were created as part of a plan referred to as the Unity. Humans will be converted to mutants because humans were unsuited to surviving in the wasteland, partly because they were just physically frail and vulnerable to radiation, and partly because they were constantly bickering amongst themselves. A single group of hardy mutants might have a better chance. It's a really great story for the mutants, because the Master has a point. We do repeatedly in Fallout 1 see different groups of humans fighting each other and struggling to survive in the wastelands. The mutants of Fallout 1 also aren't brutes. They have a plan, they have leaders, they have human allies who are helping them, they set patrols, they can maintain a military base in working order, they challenge intruders, they follow orders. In short, they're a society that has structure and a goal, and while it's different, a case can be made that they're not the bad guys. And accordingly, the Master can't be talked out of his plan by telling him it's wrong. The only thing that talks him down is providing proof that his mutant army is sterile, and thus his unity, if ever accomplished, would be a dead end that inevitably dies out in the long term. By comparison, many were disappointed by the mutants in Fallout 3, who initially seem almost more like orcs. They hang up gore bags, they yell short, poorly formed sentences, they run at you screaming with a board with a nail in it. They don't seem like a society, they just seem like animals.
This seems like a rather accurate assessment of the history of the super mutants from Fallout 1, followed by a surface-level assessment of the super mutants of Fallout 3. Steelman in Fallout 1 and Strawman in Fallout 3 is an interesting choice here.
Yes, all of this is pretty accurate. Good job. As a random side note, I've been criticized before for not highlighting parts that I agree with, and this is exactly why. If there's something I agree with, I can't really expand on it now, can I? However, in this particular case, it was important to acknowledge.
Here's one of these places where it makes me suspicious of Creed's motivation. Seems like he's adding this line in to appear as if he is acting in good faith about this response. Maybe that's why he redid this entire video, to not come off as such a bad faith actor.
And I think that interpretation is wrong, and that there's actually some really interesting stuff going on just below the surface with the mutants of Fallout 3. You see, I think the mutants actually have a very tragic story. What we see in Fallout 3 is Richard Gray's worst nightmare, and it's entirely consistent with Fallout 1.
Now that's a bold statement. Also, why switch to calling him Richard Gray? That's like casually referring to Caesar as Edward Sallow. It just comes across as someone flexing that they know the lore, which I find a bit funny as he just claimed Fallout 3 super mutants are entirely consistent with Fallout 1.
Creed's reading into this is just so condescending, it's almost funny. If I had to explain John's choice to use the name the Master had before he was turned into the creature that players were faced with at the end of Fallout 1, it would be to humanize the Master and make him more relatable for the narrative John is trying to build here. After all, without this softening of the Master's character, it would be hard for the audience to believe a villain and monster like the Master would have fears and worries. But that would just be my best guess for this choice.
You see, the idea of super mutants being big dumb brutes wasn't a Fallout 3 invention, it's absolutely in Fallout 1, most famously in the case of Harry, but Richard Gray's diary makes it very clear that most mutants are very stupid. In fact, to quote Richard Gray, "The few wanderers that have found their way here have been a disappointment to me. They can't seem to mutate correctly. The best I've been able to create are some big and dumb mutants. Most can recall nothing from before I initiated them into the wondrous unity." But it's not as obvious in Fallout 1, because most of the mutants don't speak at all, they just shoot you on sight. But given Harry's entire team is characterised as stupid, it seems reasonable to suggest that actually, the vast majority of Fallout 1 mutants are roughly of Harry's intelligence. So why do the Fallout 1 mutants have a functioning society, but the Fallout 3 mutants don't? Mostly it's down to leadership. Fallout 1's mutants are led by Richard Gray, and by the extremely small number of mutants who maintain their intelligence, like the Lieutenant. The Fallout 3 mutants have a small number of intelligent super mutants as well, in the form of Fawkes and Uncle Leo, but rather than becoming leaders, they were locked away or driven out. It's Fallout 1 society flipped on its head, and it's tragic.
It's not tragic, it's fucking stupid. John is trying really hard here to twist the situation to defend this game, and he's leaving out a key detail, because his argument here is completely invalidated by it.
Here John is building a case for why the super mutants of Fallout 3 are the victim. And they are in a way. But so was the people who the Master turned into super mutants. My guess that John was trying to humanize the Master seems more right at this point, since he's trying to make them out to be tragically misunderstood creatures. This is probably a step too far in my personal opinion with this sort of indirect appeal to emotions. Sure, they were victims before they were turned into super mutants, but now they're just monsters, at least in the eyes of most people, if not in the reality of the game. Nothing more than enemies to mow down, just as the Raiders were before. Frankly, it does not surprise me that Many a True Nerds is using this tale of woe because it will help the narrative he's trying to build based on the story of Fallout 1. It now makes sense why he was Steelman-ing that particular game. Can you say that this particular strategy is emotionally manipulating? Yes. But is it totally untrue? Not really. It's just looking at the world through the eyes of a human who is turned into a monster. I don't want to say Creed is totally incapable of doing that, but from what I've seen in his response, when it comes to Fallout 3, that's the stance he will take. Creetosis seems to be operating under the black and white binary thinking of such things as friend-enemy distinction, and either you're with us or you're against us. At least on this subject matter of Fallout 3, since Creed has clearly shows he has a distaste for most NPCs in Fallout 3, with his frequent footage showing him mowing down many of them, and his words throwing common insults at most of them.
John tries to make it sound like the dumb super mutants are the typical result of FEV exposure, and what we have in Fallout 3 is a result of a feedback loop of stupidity. However, it is explicitly explained what the difference is in the original game. Tainted humans. The Master and Lieutenant both have differing theories. One believes radiation interferes with the mutation, and the other believes a tank of FEV burst when the bombs dropped, making it airborne and affecting everyone in an extremely minor way, and as a result, having a slight resistance to it. This is why a major part of the Master's plan is cracking vaults, because they represent the solution to his problem, untainted humans being dipped, resulting in superior super mutants. Now with all that in mind, let's look at Fallout 3. Where do the super mutants come from? A vault. And what were vaults meant to do? Protect pre-war people from the nukes. Now maybe the Master was wrong about vault dwellers. Maybe him and Lieutenant were pure luck of the draw, and stupid super mutants really are the norm. Well, in Fallout 1 there's an extra ending if you decide to join the Master, which confirms his theory, as the ending says you become one of his best men. So why did Vault 87's residents all turn dumb? Well, information from outside the game clarifies that it's a different strain of FEV than what's at Mariposa. Likely because Bethesda's hack writers didn't know better, and their fuck-up had to be corrected after the fact. The lack of leadership argument is weak regardless, because the Master is a product of the FEV as well. There's no good reason within the game that the Vault 87 super mutants should be in the state we see them in, as they all would have been pure humans as well, which means they should have been smart super mutants.
There are two flaws with Creed's argument here. First, he's using one point of data to assert the Master's theory was right, which is weak supporting evidence at best. And that's assuming the Vault Dweller did not take any radiation damage during their quest to reach the Master, which seems highly unlikely. The second is that it was a different strand of FEV that had to be used at Vault 87 because the strand of FEV that turned Richard Gray into the Master wasn't even created until after the war. This was in the Fallout Bible, and not anything Bethesda wrote, of the West Coast to be at Vault 87 before the Great War, when the testing began.
Creatures that were envisioned as the next step for humanity instead embrace anti-intellectualism and drive out the few people who might actually be able to save them, regressing over time to a state where they start hanging up gore bags. And yet there's a lot more to the super mutants than even that, because they're actually grappling with the exact same problem that the Master couldn't bear to contemplate in Fallout 1, how to reproduce and survive.
The situation with the Master is far more complex than John is giving it credit for. It's not an issue he couldn't bear to contemplate, it was the guilt of his actions that weighed heavily on him. He tells you this directly. The Master doesn't kill himself because his mutants can't reproduce, it's because of the lives ruined and the people killed, all in service of a futile goal.
But it cannot be. This would mean that
all my work
has been for nothing. Everything that I've tried to a failure. It can't be. I don't think that I can continue to have done the things I have done in the name of progress and healing. It was madness. I can see that now. Madness. Madness? There is no hope. Leave now. Leave while you still have hope.
What John's describing here isn't even all that deep. They shunned intelligence and got dumber as a result. Now they're out of FEV. That's a little more than a bare-bones excuse for them to act this way and for them to be out and about in the world. It's nothing more than the absolute bare minimum to try and force them to make sense for being in the game, because they did need some official story reason, rather than just nothing at all. Don't believe me? Fallout 4's inclusion of super mutants is even more contrived. I'm probably gonna fucking shoot myself if I have to talk extensively about Fallout 4 any further.
Or someone who discounts any outside sources from defending Fallout 3, Cree sure likes to pull in outside sources from the future, like Fallout 4 and 76, to attack Fallout 3 with. This is an odd double standard to have, but I will agree with Cree on the point that Fallout 4 inclusion of the super mutants was rather contrived. FEV being researched at the repurposed vault has logic behind it. Why would a college have samples of a experimental and dangerous virus at it made to combat the new plague commissioned by the government and later developed to be used in experiments for bioweapons? I will say it is possible, I guess, but a little far-fetched. And there really isn't enough information in the lore on Dr. Frederick, who started the project at the Institute shortly after the war, to really know how he could have gotten the samples of the virus. Maybe Creed sees this as a starting of a bad trend. In that case, I can't blame him for feeling that way. Still, I believe it was more market forces that made Bethesda take even less risks and broaden its target audiences that led to this being done in Fallout 4.
Just like Richard Gray, they create new mutants by dipping humans in the green stuff, as you can overhear in Vault 87, forced evolutionary vats, which aren't seen in-game but are mentioned on several terminals. And they're empty. This is Richard Gray's nightmare, a mutant population unable to reproduce, dwindling away, an evolutionary dead end.
You do realize that saying these things are the Master's nightmare doesn't automatically make them deep, nor does it invalidate criticism, right? You aren't even addressing the criticism itself. Like, all of this is just background information at absolute best. There is no actual narrative here. There are no payoffs.
Payoff is a matter of opinion. There is a narrative reason that the super mutants are in the capital wasteland. The super mutants being at this location made it possible for the Brotherhood of Steel to stay here also. Or should I say, the super mutants being here was the best excuse for the Brotherhood to stay in the capital wasteland, especially if we go by the precedents set in Fallout Tactics. Not the greatest of reasons, but it is there. But frankly, it is impossible to tell if this is why the Lion's Pride stayed in the capital wasteland or not. But it is one of the given reasons that the game uses to justify them breaking away from the West Coast Brotherhood doctrine.
It's just orcs in an eternal blood rage, but they've been reskinned to be Fallout themed, like just about everything else in this game. Is it really that hard to understand why fans of the original games would find this frustrating? You have this deep and complex group in the original game, expanded upon and given more depth in the second, and reduced to screeching generic enemies in the third game, all with the depth of a mud puddle. If they were going to fundamentally change what super mutants were, why not just make something entirely new, instead of completely bastardizing them? As Mr. Caption said in his videos, we haven't ever seen creatures that act this way in Fallout before. It's already something new, but they applied it to an existing group and made them worse as a direct result.
This is both appeals to emotion and tradition here. I understand the arguments, but you just have to think about the East Coast super mutants as the dumb, hillbilly, possibly inbred cousins to the West Coast Hollywood elitist super mutants, if that helps you cope with the change, because that's the sort of relationship the two different groups have with each other.
Ultimately, there is one problem with this whole argument that trumps everything else. As I've already said, this is all background information that does not address the point as a whole. John has provided a lot of backstory about the super mutants, some of which derived entirely from speculation. Even if we assume the super mutants do have this tragic backstory that mirrors the plot of Fallout 1, how exactly does this address the criticism of them being orcs? You can't interact with them, save a whole 2 characters. Unless you count eavesdropping, there's no dialogue with them. Their only town is a dungeon. Functionally, the super mutants are nothing but generic enemies for the player to kill.
Dismissing 2 encounters with friendly super mutants along with the background information makes it seem like Creed is acting in bad faith here and being the gatekeeper of how a game developer should have told the story in their game. He also gives no reason why this is bad besides that Fallout 1 and 2 did it better in his opinion.
One faction I've most often seen raised as a problem with Fallout 3, the Brotherhood of Steel. Now, to some people, the Brotherhood are a big problem, and it seems to boil down to one big issue. The Brotherhood now acts in a more overtly benevolent and open fashion that feels strangely at odds with how the Brotherhood used to act in classic Fallout. Now, I'd like to address these points directly, because I'm not really sure they stand up to any scrutiny. Firstly, the Brotherhood has not changed, because this isn't the Brotherhood. And I don't just mean because this is an independent cell acting alone in a hostile environment nearly 3,000 miles from Brotherhood Command, though that is true. I mean that they literally aren't the Brotherhood anymore, and the game explicitly says this.
Ah, yes. The group that calls themselves the Brotherhood of Steel follows their command structure and naming conventions, wears the armor they're most well associated with, and is literally a chapter of the Brotherhood, aren't actually the Brotherhood. It makes total sense.
Again, saying it in a sarcastic tone isn't criticism. Is Creed just taking this chance before John explains what he means by this statement to sort of be an asshole? Wish I could say this is just a joke, but given what I am seeing so far in this video, it's probably just an indirect way of insulting, dismissing, or gaslighting John or the audience.
I mean that they literally aren't the Brotherhood anymore, and the game explicitly says this.
Lions directly refused orders, and so the West Coast cut us off. No communications, no reinforcements.
That's not really proof that this isn't the Brotherhood, though. Sure, they're cut off from the main group, but as explained, they still follow the same command structure and doctrine for the most part.
Does Creed really not understand what John's saying, or is it a straw man? Yeah, I know John isn't being very clear here, so I'll try to explain. The Brotherhood of Steel acts much like a religion. In every religion I know, there are generally different sects and subdivisions of the same religion. They all come from the same tradition, and generally have the same sort of hierarchy set up, at least at first. It does diverge at a certain point. So when they split off from the main sect, they'll keep up that tradition for at least a little bit. The Lion's Pride has just done what the Brotherhood of Steel that crashed near Chicago, the Midwest chapter, does and let outsiders into their ranks. In fact, the setup for that is those Brotherhood members were sent out eastward to chase after the fleeing super mutants because they disagreed with the Elders' policies. A soft exile, so to speak.
And in case that was too subtle, they even added in the Outcasts, a faction that left specifically because Lions wasn't following standard Brotherhood operating procedure. This isn't some lazy retcon. This is a small group that in one particular time, in one particular set of circumstances, made the choice to be something slightly different. And they've had to accept the loss of their friends and being ostracized from their own order to pay for that change.
Yeah, and this is totally ass backwards. The Brotherhood and the Outcasts in this game operate on opposite sides from what they should be. Lion's Brotherhood should be the Outcasts because the main faction has literally disowned them, and the Outcasts, as they are in-game, should be the true Brotherhood faction, and maybe given some more depth. I think fans of the original games would have far less issue if simply the names were reversed, that Lion's Outcast Brotherhood are more open, and don't act like the Brotherhood typically does. Because to any fan of the original games, it comes across as really fucking weird for the Brotherhood to be this altruistic group who want to purge the evils of the world and not be the xenophobic technophiles they've been portrayed as previously. Also, this is much the same issue as the super mutants. If you're going to go so far as to fundamentally change a group or faction, why not just make something new instead of ruining something by trampling over the previous games?
Again, another appeal to both emotion and tradition of classic Fallout fans. Instead of just calling it a fallacy this time, I'm going to explain why this would be very bad writing. No matter who adheres to the principles of the West Coast leadership, Elder Lyons is the leader in this location. The Brotherhood of Steel has a religious-like fervor for the command structure and order. Other words, breaking away from the Lion's pride is desertion. This is probably why the Outcast is trying to contact the West Coast Command Center for orders, since they have no one with any real authority in their group according to the Brotherhood's chain that binds doctrine. And that's also why the Outcast does not use the same titles, because according to the chain that binds, if any member of the Order was to defy their superiors, they would be stripped of their titles or demoted. Why this was not in the original games, probably dismissed by Creed for that reason. This doctrine was established in Fallout New Vegas. And that team was considered the team that worked on the original classic Fallout games, even though it's not entirely the truth. Breaking lore for fan service of the older fans would be an example of very bad writing. Arguments from ignorance added into the mix does not help Creed's case to anyone who's paying enough attention to the details, research the games, and know anything about rhetoric at all. About that last bit, I already addressed that in my Mr. Captions video.
Though let's actually examine how much has changed in Lyons Brotherhood, because I think that's massively overstated. You see, older Fallout fans will probably expect the Fallout 3 Brotherhood to lock themselves in a secure location which they refuse to allow you access to, but that's exactly what they do.
Right, as opposed to just camping out in the open with no defenses. Why would any major group not hold some kind of secure location if it was an option? Also, you were just saying that this isn't the Brotherhood, but now you're trying to claim they still do all the things the Brotherhood do? Are you trying to prove this by making the most tenuous and superficial comparison you possibly could? So, which is it? Is this the Brotherhood or isn't it?
John clearly states that this is the Lyons Brotherhood, not the Brotherhood of Steel. To say that they're either or is a false dichotomy, that they have to be the Brotherhood or they're not. It's not either or. It takes time for conditioned people, like most of the soldiers of the Brotherhood of Steel, to change how they act. And those people generally need a reason to make the changes to distinguish themselves from the other sex. There's more to it than that, but that is the gist of it.
As for the whole not letting outsiders in part, I'm not sure you're aware, but it's like standard procedure for military groups to not allow access to civilians, and especially in the post-apocalypse, it makes sense for just about any group to find a secure location and generally not allow randos in. No, seriously, how is the fact they've locked themselves in a secure location and disallow access in both Fallout 1 and 3 even an argument? What, are you going to say they're similar for using power armor next? What about doors? The Brotherhood in Fallout 1 used doors, and the Brotherhood in Fallout 3 used doors too.
How is what you're saying an argument? Neither John nor Creed seems like they're making much of an argument at all here. Is the rando Creed is just being let in? The base include the Lone Wanderer and the remaining members of the staff of Project Purity that the Lyons Brotherhood was so interested in getting up and running over 19 years ago? Yeah, just a group of randos. That's absolutely true, totally true. And when did Creed become an expert on post-apocalyptic military organizations? I wonder if you have to go to school for that, or if there's like an online quiz that you have to pass to get that certification. Sorry, Creed's sarcasm must be rubbing off on me.